We're supposed to be at the bottom of the food chain. We're supposed to be out there every day asking inconvenient questions, being inconvenient people, people who say things that make a room awkward suddenly, or write something that upset people in power every day. If you're not doing that, frankly, you're not doing your job as a journalist. So it's never a great idea for journalists to be made stars themselves. The story remains the star.
Hello and welcome to the Anahita Speaker Series, presented by Carnegie India, celebrating stirring stories of empowerment, struggle, and success from women professionals in different fields across the globe. Stories we hope are bound to inspire young professionals. I'm Nidhi Singh, Senior Research Analyst at Carnegie India, and today we are truly honored to have with us Ms. Suhasini Haidar. Suhasini is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, who writes on foreign policy issues and hosts a weekly online show, Worldview with Suhasini Haidar. Over the course of her nearly 3 decade long reporting career, she has covered the most challenging stories and conflicts from diverse regions, including Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Libya, Lebanon, and Syria. In India, she has covered the foreign affairs beat for over a decade, and her domestic assignments include political profiles and in depth reportage from conflict zones, including Kashmir. She is the recipient of the Prem Bhatia Award in 2015 and has won a series of awards for her work. We're thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be with you and with Carnegie India.
So let's jump right in. So, Hasni, tell us a little about how you began your journey. You've had an extraordinary career in journalism. So, how did you first get started, and what drew you specifically to the field of
Well,
foreign affairs?
Nidhi, I've now been a journalist for more than 30 years. And the truth is that when I'm asked, honestly, how did you know you would want to be in journalism? I always say to young kids, especially those in school and in college who want to think about a career in journalism, I always say, please do an internship, because you'll either be hooked from day one or it's not your thing, however much you try. And that's actually what happened to me. I was in college. I was studying. I was getting a bachelor's in statistics and maths, and I was planning to study for an MBA. And I'd also got coursework in for the colleges I was applying to. Many of them, of course, in those days, it was abroad. There weren't so many in India at that time. And I realized one day that I was just staring at coursework for the next few years, which would really, deaden me in a sense. It just did not excite me. And I saw, that there was a kind of interest already in journalism. I was thrilled by the news. I watched every kind of television news in those days in the early 90s. There were so many international channels suddenly coming available to us because of satellite television. And I got a chance to work with someone on a documentary. And this friend kind of just brought me along as an extra, but I was hooked from day one. And let me tell you, in 30 years, there may have been a lot of regrets for a lot of things, but I have never one day woken up and thought, I wish I hadn't become a journalist, or that, you know, what am I going to do now? It's always been, what's today's story? What am I looking forward to doing next? And I think that's when I speak to people, and we end up interviewing so many people in different walks of life. And when I speak to very sort of successful people or very famous people, I tend to find that they have a similar kind of a feeling that they just know they belong. And which is why on my Instagram, I think you'll always see the motto, work's not work if you love what you do. So that's really how I got into the profession. I studied, I applied and did my masters in the U.S. I then got an internship at CNN International, working at the United Nations at the time, which was very exciting. I really enjoyed all of that. But I did feel at some points that, if you're doing journalism, somehow you know your own story better, you know your own country or where you're from, your culture, you know that much better. And I kept thinking I wasn't as comfortable telling stories to an audience that wasn't my audience about things that weren't necessarily the most important thing for me. And so I came back. I got lucky. I got a job with CNN in India, I've been in the profession one way or another for the last 3 decades.
Thanks, Hasini. That's very interesting to hear. I think this pivot from a math degree to such an outstanding career in journalism, it sounds very fascinating. Clearly, there were a lot of like pivotal points that you've had that have shaped your career, like you talked about your internships, your experiences, just working in different fields before choosing, I think, specifically to specialize in foreign affairs. Uh, One of the things that we see from your writing is that you have a very distinctive style and a voice that you write in. So, as you're telling us a little bit about how you shaped your career, were any of these moments, any of these pivotal moments that helped shape how you write, how you think about foreign affairs, the voice and the reporting style that you use? How did that come about in these 30
That's
years?
that's an interesting question, because obviously all of us feel we're a work in progress, that you're constantly trying to upgrade your writing, make it more relevant, because eventually at the base of it all, journalists are communicators. We're here to tell a story. It's not as if it's a job that others can't do, but it is a job that you do and others do, other professions. um, I think perhaps because of my particular career path, the idea of neutrality was very important to me. When I first went for my internship at CNN at the United Nations, the UN correspondent, who was a very formidable person, said, I have to interview you. And when he interviewed me, he asked me about every part of the world, and I thought I got a lot of my answers right. But I slipped up when it came to India. And because I kept referring to it as, we and you and all of that. And he said, there is no we and you. You're a journalist, you're the fly on the wall, you're telling others the story of what happened. You can't do that if you are going to take on the identity of the story itself. And that was an early lesson for me to learn. I'm not sure it's the most popular lesson today, because you can probably see on Twitter, on social media, and a lot of television channels, there's this constant desire to align yourself with one identity, with one particular way of thinking, and not to, in fact, to see that as a badge of honor. That's not my background, and that's not how I practice my journalism. The idea is that we are trying to break down a story, trying to explain a story to those who are, who are interested in what's going on in the world. So I think that was one. The fact that I worked for CNN International, and in those days we worked in the South Asia Bureau, meant I traveled in South Asia a lot: India, Pakistan, a bit of Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, all such interesting countries, the Maldives once as well, and really interesting countries, but each one had its own unique conflict. And you learn very quickly that you cannot be seen as taking sides. So there's a training in that sense to not be partisan, no matter what your personal feelings are. We all have personal feelings, we all have personal opinions. But we also know that, unlike others who maybe you may be a computer engineer, but you were on Twitter putting out your personal opinion as if it doesn't matter. But in our case, I remember Prime Minister Modi saying in an interview once that I know what each of you think because I read your Twitter. And the truth is that journalists do have to find a way of blending that line a little bit, of understanding that on certain issues, you're not actually there to be partisan. Nobody wants to know what your biased opinion is. People want to know what the news is, what is the information. And I'm sorry I'm going on so long, but I do feel that this idea of neutrality meant a different kind of attitude towards journalism. Today, journalists are more aligned than ever before, and yet they are more discredited, if I may say so, than ever before. And people, even though they want you to take a certain line, eventually will say, oh, but everyone's biased. Um, in the old days, the idea was journalists were courted by all sides. You could get interviews with leaders on both sides of a conflict, both sides of of two countries, and it was considered okay. Today, we frequently face a lot of public criticism for even interviewing a leader of another country, because it's not, because they're not saying something that we want to hear. But the idea of journalism is always to give you that extra, to tell you about what's happening in a place where you're not necessarily able to see what's happening. So I think that really did shape my reporting style, where I'd like to think a lot of my reporting comes from, is from being on the ground and from seeing the basic humanity of people, the basic kindness of people, no matter where you go. Which is why I kind of constantly tell young journalism students, please travel as much as you can. It doesn't have to be always on work. But until you go to another place, until you start looking at what the situation on the ground for anyone is, we tend to see ourselves as kind of heroes on planes, jetting off to various places with this grand idea of strategies. But eventually strategies hurt people, and in fact they hurt people much more than they hurt the strategists themselves. And I think it's important to put those human faces in front of you when you report. So I do hope that that is what my journalism is informed by, a knowledge of the ground, of dealing with real people, and a desire not to necessarily be seen as aligned on one side or another. Of course, you want to be seen with certain values. You want to be you do want to be seen as someone who has certain principles as well, and ethics when you're a journalist, but not to the point where it is impossible for you to tell more than one side of the story.
No, it's so interesting to hear from a journalist, and especially one who's been working in diplomatic affairs for so long, to hear what the other side feels like. Because you can definitely see that news is a lot more polarized. Generally, I think this era is a lot more polarized than it used to be. And as an impact of that, everything has become more polarized. And what is now objectivity has suddenly become a question, which maybe wasn't a question a few years ago. And how you report things has now become so, it's a very right or a wrong answer, which maybe it wasn't quite seen that way. Bipartisanship by itself, or non-partisanship, shall I say, in the case of India, is again a very complicated question, where I think there's a lot more expectation for people to take sides now. So the evolution of that and how journalists keep up with that, it's something I think a lot of people wonder. It's also quite interesting to see how that field changes so rapidly, and what would be considered, I think, objective tomorrow may not quite be what is objective today. So it's interesting to see how that will sort of pan out. But drawing from what you were talking about your travels, about reporting on ground, uh, I did actually have another question. So you've clearly reported from a lot of places, you've been to a lot of conflict zones, you talk to people on ground. When you first started out, you were one of the few female journalists. So, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to be in these places? What were the challenges that you faced early on, sort of doing this ground reporting from conflict zones? What it was like for women in journalism at the time? If you could
Um,
tell us a little bit about that.
See, I think it would be wrong for me to feel that I came from the generation of pioneering women in journalism, because there were many more pioneers before me. There were the women who fought to go into covering battles, like Prabhadat. There were those like Kamla Mankekar, who walked out of a job in journalism because her editor was inappropriate with her at a time when it was really unheard of. There were people who fought for that women's bathroom in an office full of men. There are women who have fought for every bit of where we've gotten to. So I do want to make the point that while yes, there are challenges and there are specific challenges to women, as there are for any identity, any kind of identity you belong to will have its own challenges. I'm sure it has its own advantages as well. I think as a woman, you have a certain empathy when you're out in the field. I'm not saying men don't have that. I'm just saying it comes very naturally. There are obvious ones. There are obvious challenges, like those who will say women should not cover conflict at all. Give the job to a man unless a woman is really, really pushing for it. That's certainly one. I've been told a lot of times that women can't live with soldiers in the trenches. There's just some things you can't do. These persist despite women having done these jobs. I think there's another. There was this one moment I remember, and it's done sometimes very subtly. So you have to be prepared for it. I remember walking into a meeting where we were discussing who would go into the war in Lebanon. And a senior editor just sidled up to me on the way in and said, "Don't worry, just don't say anything. I'll make sure you don't have to go." And I kind of looked at him like, "Why would you do that?" And he said, "No, no, you have little children. There's no question that you can go and cover this." And I totally understand. And I said, "No, I'm sorry. Please let the editors decide who they want to assign. I am not going to say no to the assignment." I can remember, even on that particular assignment, it was very funny because I nearly didn't get onto the Indian naval warship that was going into Beirut Harbor because they were all men. All the other journalists who were going were men, and the admiral on the ship, who became a dear friend after that, said to me, "What do you expect me to do? I have 400 men or whatever it was on this ship." And I'm going to take one woman. I have to take responsibility for what happens to you. And I said, "Don't worry. You can put me in a box and take me out at the other end. I don't mind, but I can't miss the assignment. I've come all the way that time to Cyprus, and I can't go back now without a story." And so he was convinced. He took me, and we actually, it worked out just fine. But you need to keep pushing back when you face those challenges, because it is too easy to say, "Okay, maybe this will be very inconvenient to do," and people will consistently try to make that case with you. I mean, years ago, I was involved in a bomb blast. It's probably one of the most formative experiences towards my journalism in a certain sense, because it just decided physically, since I was injured, what I could do and what I couldn't do at a certain point of time. And I remember one of the times walking. I had my hand in my arm in a bandage, and I had gone shopping with my husband, and it had been on the news that I'd been injured. And one of the people we were whose shop we were looking at things at kind of just turned around and told my husband, "Why do you let her go?" And his response, of course, was, "I'm not sure she'd listen to me if I tried to stop her." But his point was, why should I stop someone from doing what is their job? And I think that's, those are the little pushbacks that you don't expect to have to make, but it is a certain constant. The idea that in the newsroom, certain kind of soft stories will be given only to women. And therefore certain kind of hard stories will not. In the studio, the sexism becomes almost institutionalized, because this is something that's hardly spoken about, but it exists in television newsrooms across the world, where women have to deal with that little ideal body weight, shape, and size at all times, and constantly deal with the stereotypes of having to fit into these snug suits that are decided by some stylist, not necessarily comfortable in what they're doing, but that becomes a big part of it. The idea that there's always someone younger, thinner, and willing to work for less than you, does stare at a lot of television personalities. And I think it's worth, I'm no longer in television, but I did work in TV for 20 years, and I think it's necessary for people to recognize that that is really anachronistic. It's really out of touch with the times. And I think there are certain barriers. For example, if you were to go to Taliban uh, run Afghanistan, the truth is you will not necessarily be able to do as good a job as your male colleague, because your male counterparts would have access. They would be able to speak to men. They'd be able to go outdoors without being questioned. Those are kind of structural limits. In Iran, for example, women are expected to be covered a certain way, or in the old days, certainly in Saudi Arabia. I think a lot of this is changing. So there were those kind of structural challenges that maybe women felt when they were journalists. But women over the ages have fought back, and that's what I keep saying, that keep pushing back, even if it's that one little thing, because at the end of the day, we recognize that women bring something very special to journalism as well.
Yes, I think, but also to your point of that there were pioneers before you, I do think that that's more of a journey. So it's equally true that there were pioneers before you, and it's equally true that you are a pioneer to some people as well. And hopefully in the future we'll have more people who are pushing back as we make this journey towards, I think, more equality, better working conditions for women in journalism. So I do think that just given your journey and the way that you've done your reporting, you're probably quite an inspiration to many young women who are entering journalism.
This is all very kind of you to say, but I always say don't put journalists on pedestals. We're supposed to be at the bottom of the food chain. We're supposed to be out there every day asking inconvenient questions, being inconvenient people, people who say things that make a room awkward suddenly, or write something that upset people in power every day. If you're not doing that, frankly, you're not doing your job as a journalist. So it's never a great idea for journalists to be made stars themselves. The story remains the star.
Now that we have you with us, I think I would be remiss if I did not ask you a question on India's foreign policy. Since you've been reporting on it so long, there's so much happening right now. What would you say, in your opinion, just given the wide body of experience you have and the amount of reporting you've done, has been a significant shift in India's diplomatic approach in the recent years? Because there have been quite a few shifts. So I think, like, if you had to just talk about one general trend that you see happening that you think will continue over the next
So,
couple of
in the
years, what would
broader
you say
sense,
that
if I
is?
were to divide India from 1947 or say 1950 all the way to 2020, 25, I always divide it up into eras of idealism, eras of realism, and then ideas of realpolitik. I shudder to say, but we are moving globally into an era of just transactionalism. So those would be four broad areas I would talk about a shift. But many talk about the shift in terms of leaders, in terms of personality. There was Narasimha Rao's policy, there was Manmohan Singh's policy, there was Vajpayee's policy, there's Modi's policy. To be really honest, I think some of the shifts in Indian diplomacy are just a sign of the time. So if Indian diplomacy has become much more people friendly, for example, you get your passports much easier, you are able to access the MEA's website and get a lot of information much easier. It's a digital age. There's a lot more going on that would perhaps be part of the shift with any sphere. Then there are the shifts that have come in policy in terms of alignment and non-alignment. I think that's where people see a difference. That perhaps in the old days there was this era of non-alignment. It was seen as extremely idealistic and totally useless. But non-alignment has always had its uses. And even in the last 5 years, I've seen us move back after many years of speaking about India's interests being the most important, and therefore giving up the hesitations of history, moving much more Western words. I think all that we've seen is a kind of rebalancing. And now again, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, we hear people talk about strategic autonomy. We hear them speak about multi-alignment or multi-polarization of the world, and India's place as one of the poles in the world. That has always been the case. The pitch to the global south in the last few years, that's not something new. That's come from the 1960s, I think. So, in a sense, I think it gets repackaged every time as something really new. There's no question that when it comes to technology, a lot has changed. And that's where I'd see a difference in foreign policy. And it's been a gradual one over the years. Since the early 1990s, we speak a lot more about things like economic diplomacy, about energy diplomacy, about technology diplomacy, about nuclear diplomacy. These are all parts of a foreign policy journalist's repertoire. You have to know about these issues. Climate change diplomacy. You have to know about what is India's position, where India is being pulled in what directions, and what are the two sides or what are the various thoughts on any of these policies that I just described. So I think there you are seeing a shift, and India is moving in a certain direction, for example, on climate, or is moving in a certain direction on nuclear power or renewable power. But also in terms of technology, of economic diplomacy. When I started out, honestly, we didn't even talk about economic diplomacy. You did not hear that so many MOUs were signed and so many businessmen were met. Now it's a necessity of the times. Or energy diplomacy, the idea that you go to a country essentially to figure out where your energy needs are going to come from. So I think that kind of shift has definitely taken place. There's a little more clarity on that. But in terms of the broad strokes of Indian diplomacy, I think it's what they call swings and roundabouts. It goes forward in one direction, but it's also fairly consistent.
Yeah, I think we can see a pendulum swing happening on a lot of countries right now on the way they are approaching these questions. I do have a concluding question where I want to ask about your general advice, but before we get to that, uh, I have some rapid fire questions for you. It'll be good to get your narrow view on some very specific things that you've experienced in your life. So I'm just going to ask them and you have to answer really quickly, just in 1 or 2 words. What's the best street food you've tried during your assignments?
Okay, so there's a lot. I have to say I've basically been vegetarian mostly during my career. I would say chaat, both in Indore and Lahore, fabulous. But also I can't go without talking about ice cream, especially in the Middle East. There's something called booza. I think the Turks have another name for it, which is literally beaten as you speak and made into this kind of elasticy thing. Syria, I remember in Damascus, near the big mosque there. That was really something that stayed in my mind.
What is one foreign capital that you could live in for a year?
Thimphu. Anywhere in South Asia, to be honest, you can take me anywhere in the region. Obviously, it would be difficult for an Indian to live in Pakistan today, but otherwise, the kind of sort of similarities in a lot of our cultures in the region. But Bhutan, just for the beauty, for the people, for the changes that are going on over there that are really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. It's a beautiful country. What is one book that changed your worldview?
I read mostly nonfiction. I rarely read fiction. But obviously, George Orwell in 1984 has an impact because it's fiction that looks like nonfiction today. I read a lot of biographies, a lot of books that have documents in them, accounts by ambassadors. So A.S. Basi and Satinder Lamba, two people whose books I keep going back to.
What is a diplomat or a leader that you found unexpectedly charming?
um, I think one of the leaders I was actually surprised by was the former Indonesian President Joko Widodo, who demitted office after finishing his two terms, even though he actually had the chance to do another term. A lot of the times, I judge leaders that I speak to by how comfortable their own staff members are around them. There are certain leaders who are very charming to a journalist, but you can tell by the tension in the room that they're actually really tough bosses. and probably not such nice people, but he was an exception.
And finally, what is one headline that you wish you had written?
If I could just add to the previous line, sometimes the interesting and the most charming people that you get to speak to are the family members. And I make a point of trying to meet family members. So there was Musharraf's mother, for example, Begum Zareen, really strong, practically single mother. Who was a very charming person, had grown up in India, went to college in India, so had a lot of fond memories of India. Prime Minister Modi's mother as well, very charming, simple lady with with a really vivid memory. She had a very good memory when I met her in 2009, but extremely hospitable and charming. So I think sometimes it's the family. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was more, was not known as a charmer. But when you saw him in his own house being bullied by all the women, his three daughters and his wife, and his own, way of walking around the kitchen quite comfortably, I think that sort of is endearing. Sorry,
One
you.
headline,
Yeah.
one headline you wish you had written.
Well, every journalist is trained with the headline "Headless Body Found in Topless Bar." So no, I'm not. I don't feel. I wish I had written that one. One phrase always stays in my mind, and it's not necessarily a headline, but it was a Nehru's statement about Gandhi's assassination when he said, "The light has gone out of our lives," and it's a phrase that always stays in my mind because how do you how do you describe an epochal moment when something so big happens, and somehow that phrase was able to capture it.
So, towards the very end, my final question to you, for young journalists, especially women, what advice would you offer to those who are aspiring to specialize in diplomatic and foreign affairs reporting? So, from just this interview, I can already see that it requires a lot of groundwork, requires you to go in prepared, requires you to have a very wide body of knowledge. But are there any sort of practical steps that you would suggest that, especially maybe young women, should consider as they are planning a career in foreign affairs reporting?
Sure, and I wouldn't say it particularly to women or men because honestly, you need to approach journalism as a career as it is. There is no she journalist and he journalist. Journalism is a gender a specific profession, and I would say the first is always to read. In fact, the thing to do is to ensure you always have a book in your hand. That way, when you have or in on your phone, that way whenever you have a spare moment, and so much of our lives are spent waiting for somebody, waiting for something to happen, you're always reading because that makes a difference. Read history accounts, documents, go to, and find original documents if possible. I mean, you have to keep up with the news just for your own profession, but do the extra bit of reading that others don't do because that'll give you an edge. It'll make you the person who bosses want to hire, and will make you eventually an editor that your juniors look up to. Engage. If you don't enjoy meeting people, don't become a journalist. Just go out there and meet people constantly, speak to people constantly about what they think. Meet officials, but also make sure you are always getting more than one perspective. And third, I'd say try and build yourself a niche. There's always something inside you that you enjoy more than anything else. Some kind of journalism, some kind of region that you might enjoy, a language that you might want to learn, and therefore that area becomes your specialty anywhere where that language is spoken. But find that niche. I mean, if you had asked me 30 years ago what my niche was, I would have no idea. 30 years later, I can tell you that my interest is and remains in India's neighborhood. And that is something that I have over time then built on. But have that in mind that you need to build yourself a little space within a very large sphere of analysts and journalists and think tankers and television experts and all the rest. And if you are able to build for yourself a little area that you always find interesting, then that is very rewarding for you as well as it does help you along the way.
Yes, I think the use of interstitial spaces to do something productive is something Umberto Eco has talked about a lot in his work as well. Thank you so much, Suhasini, for joining us today, sharing your remarkable experiences and insights. To our
Thank you.
audience,
I have to tell you, nobody ever asks a journalist to speak about themselves. So this is an unusual experience, and thank you for that.
no, I think that your conversation is something that will be very helpful, knowledgeable, and will also inspire a lot of the people in this particular field. I do think that there's some entry barrier in the sense that people don't really know maybe what a journalist does, especially if you don't have any maybe family in this field, and there's not a lot of idea on how to enter into it, especially if you're making a pivot like you did from, say, maths to journalism. Then I think it'll be useful for people to know that this is how you go about it. So, to our audience, we hope you are as inspired by this conversation as we were. Stay connected to Carnegie India's YouTube channel for more Anahita Speaker Series videos.